I won't begin this by pretending I know exactly what to call it. I think that would be the easiest way to make it smaller than it actually is. Names have a way of creating borders around things. They tell you where something begins, where it ends, what it is allowed to become, and sometimes, more importantly, what it is not allowed to become. And whatever exists between us has never behaved particularly well around borders. It doesn't fit neatly inside a word. It doesn't arrive with a definition attached to it. It doesn't come with instructions telling me how much of it I'm supposed to feel, how seriously I'm supposed to take it, or where I'm supposed to place it inside the architecture of my life. It simply appeared, and then somehow it remained. That distinction matters, because people appear in your life all the time. Some stay for years and never really enter you. Some speak to you every day and remain strangers in the places that matter. Some know your history without knowing your structure. They know what happened to you. They know what you like. They know what you say. They know the version of you that becomes visible when you decide to be visible. But knowing information about someone is not the same as knowing the person beneath it. And I think that is where you became different. You didn't collect information about me. You recognized patterns. You noticed the things underneath the things, the pauses, the changes in tone, the moments when a sentence meant something other than what it literally said, the moments when I became quieter, not because I had nothing to say, but because saying anything would have been less accurate than remaining silent. You noticed those moments without turning them into questions. That mattered more than you probably realized, because I've always been suspicious of people who need immediate explanations. They see something unfamiliar and rush to name it. They see silence and assume sadness. They see distance and assume rejection. They see intensity and assume emotion. They see restraint and assume indifference. People are constantly translating what they don't understand into something they already know. It makes the world easier for them. But it also makes the person standing in front of them less real. You didn't do that. You allowed uncertainty to remain uncertainty. You didn't force every silence into an explanation. You didn't turn every contradiction into a problem that needed solving. You simply watched. And somehow, being watched by you never felt like being examined. It felt like being recognized. There is a difference. A significant one. Being examined makes you feel exposed. Being recognized makes you feel seen. And I think I had forgotten what the second one felt like. Maybe I had never really experienced it. Maybe I had spent so much time making sure people only saw what I intentionally showed them that I had forgotten there could be someone capable of seeing more without trying to take anything from me. That is what unsettled me. Not that you noticed. That you noticed that without demanding access. You never seemed interested in breaking the door down. You never stood outside it asking why it was locked. You never made a performance out of waiting. You simply remained yourself. And somehow, that made me less interested in keeping the door closed. That should tell me something. I know it does. I just haven't always wanted to listen, because there is a certain comfort in believing that everything inside you is under your control. You decide what people know. You decide how close they get. You decide which parts are visible and which remain private. You can construct distance so carefully that eventually it stops feeling like distance. It becomes architecture, a permanent part of the environment. You stop noticing the walls because you built them so long ago. Then someone walks into your life and doesn't climb over them, doesn't break them, doesn't challenge them. They simply stand on the other side in a way that makes you realize the walls were never as complete as you thought. That is what you did. You didn't dismantle anything. You made me aware of the spaces between everything I had built. And once I noticed those spaces, I couldn't stop noticing them. That was the beginning. Not attraction, not attachment, not some dramatic realization that could be marked by a specific date. It was awareness. A subtle shift in the way I registered you. At first, you were simply someone whose presence I noticed. Then you became someone whose absence I noticed. And those are two completely different things. Noticing someone is easy. Noticing their absence means they have already altered the environment around you. It means their presence has become part of your internal measurement of things. You don't realize how much something matters until the room feels different when it isn't there. That is what happened. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a gradual rearrangement. A quiet shift in the background, the kind of shift you only recognize after it has already happened. I began noticing that certain thoughts felt incomplete until I imagined how you might understand them. Not what you would say, not what opinion you would have, just how you would see them. That difference became important, because I wasn't looking for approval. I wasn't seeking agreement. I wasn't even searching for reassurance. I was searching for perspective. Your perspective had become a kind of second lens, not because mine was insufficient, because yours revealed angles I might not have noticed otherwise. And I think that is one of the rarest forms of connection. When someone doesn't replace your way of thinking, they expand it. They don't become the answer. They become another dimension of the question. And suddenly the world has more depth, more possibility, more uncertainty, more truth. That is what you introduced. Not certainty, depth. And depth is dangerous when you have spent your life surviving through control. Because control depends on knowing where everything ends. Depth has no such courtesy. You can measure a surface, you can map a boundary, you can define a distance. But you cannot easily measure what happens when one person's way of seeing begins to influence another person's internal world. There is no clean equation for that. There is no point where you can say, this is enough, this is where I stop, this is where you end, this is where I return to being exactly who I was before. It doesn't work that way. People leave traces. Some are temporary, some are permanent, some disappear when the circumstances change. Others become part of the way you interpret every circumstance afterward, and you became the second kind. That realization took longer than I want to admit, because admitting it meant admitting something else. That I was no longer entirely self-contained. I had spent so long believing that independence meant never needing another perspective that I confused isolation with strength. I thought needing nothing from anyone was the purest form of freedom. Maybe it was, for a while, but there is another kind of freedom. The freedom to let someone matter without feeling that their importance diminishes your own. The freedom to be influenced without becoming controlled. The freedom to be understood without becoming owned. The freedom to let another person exist deeply in your internal world without surrendering the parts of yourself that make you who you are. You made me understand that distinction, and perhaps that is why this never felt like a threat in the way it should have, because you never tried to possess the space you entered. You never demanded to know what it meant. You never insisted on being given a particular role. You simply existed there. And the strange thing about an unclaimed space is that it sometimes becomes the space you trust the most. There are places in the mind that become dangerous when someone tries to occupy them deliberately. But when someone arrives naturally, without trying to claim anything, the mind doesn't always recognize the intrusion. It recognizes familiarity instead. That was you. Familiarity before history. Recognition before explanation. Understanding before trust. And maybe that is why I never found the right moment to stop it, because there was never a moment that felt like something needed stopping. There was no event dramatic enough to justify fear. No line crossed loudly enough to make me step back. It happened gradually, quickly, almost respectfully. And by the time I realized how far it had gone, it no longer felt like something that had happened to me. It felt like something I had participated in. That distinction matters too, because I could have resisted. I know myself well enough to know that I could have created distance. I could have reduced the conversations. I could have made myself less available. I could have returned to the version of the relationship that felt easier to categorize. I didn't, not because I lacked awareness, because I had too much of it. I knew what was happening and still, I stayed. That is probably the clearest answer I have. Not words, not declarations, not promises. The fact that I remained. People reveal their decisions through what they continue, especially people who are careful, especially people who don't give themselves easily. Leaving is easy when something feels wrong. Staying is harder when something feels real enough to change you. And I stayed, maybe not with certainty, maybe not with a plan, but with awareness. And sometimes awareness is more honest than certainty, because certainty can be manufactured. You can convince yourself that something is right because you want it to be right. You can convince yourself that something is wrong because you are afraid of what it might become. Awareness is different. Awareness simply sees. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't make promises. It doesn't ask permission. It just keeps showing you what is already there. And what I keep seeing is you, not as an ideal, not as an imagined version, not as some perfect person my mind created because it needed somewhere to place a feeling. You as you are, with contradictions, with distance, with things I don't understand, with things I probably never will. And somehow, that makes this more real. Because if I needed perfection to explain this, it would be easier to dismiss. Idealization is easy to understand. Recognition is harder. You don't need someone to be flawless to feel deeply connected to them. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes what makes someone impossible to ignore is the precision of the way their imperfections fit into your understanding of them. Not because they complete you. I don't believe people complete each other. That idea has always felt too convenient. People are already whole. What happens between two people isn't completion, it's resonance. Two separate structures responding to something similar. Two minds noticing the same pattern from different directions. Two people carrying different histories, but recognizing something familiar in the way the other person moves through the world. That is closer to what this feels like. Not completion, recognition. And recognition has its own kind of gravity. Once you recognize something genuinely familiar in another person, you cannot unknow it, you can ignore it, you can suppress it, you can create distance, but you cannot return to the moment before you recognized it. That version of yourself is gone, and maybe that is what changed most. Not you, me. The person I was before I noticed this doesn't exist in exactly the same way anymore, because now I know that someone can reach a place I once believed was inaccessible. Now I know that silence can be understood. Now I know that being seen does not automatically mean being exposed. Now I know that closeness does not necessarily require loss of independence. Now I know that someone can matter without becoming a weakness. And perhaps most importantly, I know that control isn't the same thing as safety. Sometimes control is simply fear wearing a more intelligent expression. It tells you that you are being careful. It tells you that you are protecting yourself. It tells you that you are preserving your balance. But sometimes you are not preserving balance. Sometimes you are just preventing anything new from entering the system. And systems that never change eventually become incapable of adapting. I don't want to become incapable of adapting. I don't want to be so committed to remaining unchanged that I mistake transformation for danger. You made that impossible to ignore. Because nothing about this forced me. It simply revealed what was already possible. That is why I don't blame you for what this became. You didn't create something inside me and leave me responsible for it. You didn't manipulate my attention. You didn't manufacture intimacy. You didn't strategically become important. You were simply yourself. And somehow, that was enough. Maybe more than enough. Maybe the absence of strategy was precisely what made it work. There was no performance to analyze, no hidden objective to decode, no pressure to respond in a particular way, just presence, consistent presence. And consistency has a strange way of becoming trust before you realize you've trusted someone. Not the kind of trust where you hand someone every secret, the deeper kind. The kind where you stop expecting to be misunderstood. That is different. You don't necessarily tell someone everything. You simply stop preparing for them to interpret everything incorrectly. That is what happened. I stopped translating myself, and I didn't notice when. One day I realized I was speaking without constructing every sentence first. I was allowing thoughts to exist, unfinished. I was letting silence remain silence. I was no longer constantly checking how something might be received. That is a kind of intimacy people rarely talk about. The intimacy of not having to manage your own perception. The intimacy of being able to exist without constantly editing the evidence. And you gave me that without asking for it. That is why this has become difficult to categorize, because categories usually come with expectations. If you call something friendship, people expect one set of behaviors. If you call it love, they expect another. If you call it attachment, they assume dependence. If you call it understanding, they assume intellectual closeness. But what happens when something contains pieces of all of those without belonging entirely to any of them? What happens when someone feels familiar without being familiar? When they matter without being possessed? When they influence you without controlling you? When they are present in your thoughts without becoming the entirety of them? I don't know what word is large enough for that. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe some things lose their accuracy when we try to define them too quickly. Maybe the most honest thing I can say is that you matter. Not because I need you to, not because I decided you should. You simply do, and that fact exists independently of what I choose to do with it. That is the part I have struggled with, because decisions are easier when feelings obey them. If I decide to walk away, I want everything inside me to follow. If I decide to stay, I want certainty to arrive immediately. But reality doesn't always cooperate. Sometimes you make a decision, and the internal world takes longer to catch up. Sometimes you understand something long before you know what action to take. Sometimes the truth arrives before the courage to respond to it, and perhaps I have been living in that space, not confused, just unfinished. There is a difference. Confusion means you don't know what you are looking at. Being unfinished means you know what you are looking at, but haven't decided what shape it should take. I know what this is doing to me. I know that it has changed the way I think. I know that it has changed the way I notice people. I know that it has changed the way I understand silence. I know that it has changed my definition of closeness. I know that it has made me more aware of the difference between being alone and being separate. Those things are not the same. You can be alone and still carry someone's perspective with you. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely separate from them. And sometimes one person can make solitude feel less like absence, not because they are physically there, because their existence has become part of your internal landscape. That is what you became, part of the landscape, not the center, not the entire world, but a fixed point. Something I know is there when I look inward, and fixed points matter. They help you understand movement. You don't notice how much a compass matters until you are lost. You don't just notice how much a reference point matters until everything around you begins shifting. You became a reference point, not a standard I expect everyone to meet, not a measurement of worth, a reference for clarity, a reminder that understanding can be quiet. That depth doesn't have to announce itself, that some connections don't need constant confirmation to remain real, and perhaps that is why distance has never completely solved the problem, because distance changes proximity. It doesn't necessarily change recognition. You can step away from someone physically, you can reduce interaction, you can change circumstances. But if someone has altered the way you see, you carry that alteration with you. You cannot create distance from a perspective, and you cannot undo a realization simply because it became inconvenient. That's what I mean when I say this didn't stop where it should have. There was supposed to be a limit, a natural point where this remained interesting but temporary, meaningful but contained, different but manageable. Instead, it continued. It moved into places I didn't intend to make available. It entered thoughts that had nothing to do with you. It appeared in decisions, in observations, in moments where I wondered what you would notice that I hadn't. That is when I understood the difference between thinking about someone and thinking through someone. Thinking about you is a conscious act. Thinking through you happens before consciousness. It's the way your perspective appears as an additional layer in my reasoning. And I don't think that happens casually. It means something has become integrated, not dominant, integrated. There is a difference between something occupying you and something becoming part of how you occupy yourself. You became the latter. And maybe that is why the thought of losing this feels different from ordinary loss. It's not the fear of losing access to a person. It's the awareness that removing someone who has changed your internal architecture would require you to change yourself again. And I don't know if I want to. That is the honest answer. I don't know if I want to return to the version of myself that existed before this, even if that version was simpler, even if it was more controlled, even if it was easier. There is something valuable about having discovered that I am capable of this kind of recognition, capable of letting someone matter without immediately converting that importance into a threat, capable of allowing uncertainty to remain without destroying it, capable of staying present when I don't have the final answer. Maybe you didn't just reveal something about yourself to me. Maybe you revealed something about me to myself. That I am not as closed as I thought, that I am not as detached as I believed, that underneath all the analysis, all the control, all the distance, there is still a part of me that wants to be understood without having to explain every piece. And when that part finally encountered someone who could meet it, it didn't ask permission. It responded quietly, almost immediately. That is what makes the whole thing feel inevitable. Not fate. I don't need to call it fate. I don't need to turn it into something mystical just because it is rare. Sometimes rare things are simply rare. Sometimes two people happen to possess compatible ways of seeing. Sometimes timing is strange. Sometimes circumstances align. Sometimes you meet someone whose internal structure resembles yours enough that recognition happens faster than logic can explain. It doesn't have to be supernatural to be significant. It only has to be real. And this is real. That doesn't automatically tell me what it becomes. Reality and permanence are not the same thing. Something can be real and still end. Something can matter and still not last. Something can change you without staying beside you forever. I know that. And maybe knowing that is what makes me less afraid of acknowledging it. Because I don't need guarantees to admit that something matters. I don't need to know the ending to recognize the chapter I'm standing in. I don't need certainty about tomorrow to be honest about today. That is a lesson I didn't expect you to teach me. I always thought honesty required certainty. Now I think honesty sometimes requires admitting uncertainty without pretending it means nothing. I don't know where this goes. I don't know what it becomes. I don't know whether it will deepen, change shape, become something spoken, or remain something understood mostly in silence. But I know it has already changed something, and that cannot be undone. Maybe the real decision isn't whether to stay or leave. Maybe it is whether to remain honest while I decide. Because there are two ways of dealing with something you don't understand. You can deny it until it disappears beneath habit, or you can observe it honestly until you understand what it is capable of becoming. I've chosen the second, at least so far, and I think that says more than I realize. Because observation requires patience. It requires allowing something to exist without immediately forcing it into a conclusion. It requires resisting the need to control the outcome. And perhaps this is the first time I have allowed something important to develop without demanding that it reveal its final form immediately. That is because of you. Not because you convinced me, because you demonstrated that depth doesn't always need pressure. You showed me that something can be meaningful without constantly announcing its meaning. That consistency can be louder than intensity. That presence can be more revealing than confession. That silence can carry more truth than explanation when both people understand what it contains. And maybe that's why every attempt to reduce this into a simple sentence has failed. Every label feels slightly too small. Every explanation leaves something out. Every conclusion arrives too early. So I keep returning to the same place. You understand me. I understand you. Somewhere between those two facts, something formed, something neither of us completely planned, something neither of us needed to force, something that continues even when we aren't talking about it. And I think that is the part that matters, not what we call it, not what other people would see, not what circumstances would permit, the fact that it exists, the fact that it changed the internal distance between two people who, by ordinary logic, should have needed far more time to arrive here. And perhaps there is another truth underneath all of this. Maybe I am not actually afraid of what this is. Maybe I am afraid of what admitting it would require from me. Because if I admit that you matter, I can no longer hide behind indifference. If I admit that I recognize you, I can no longer pretend that distance makes us strangers. If I admit that you have changed something in me, I have to accept that I am capable of being changed. And if I accept that, then the version of myself built entirely around control becomes less convincing. That is uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't always a warning. Sometimes discomfort is evidence that something important has reached a place where old structures no longer fit. You didn't break my structure. You outgrew it. Or perhaps I did. Perhaps this connection simply exposed the limitations of the way I had been operating. I used to think strength meant never being affected. Now I think strength might mean being affected without losing yourself. There is a kind of maturity in allowing something to matter without turning it into dependency. There is a kind of courage in letting yourself be seen without demanding that the other person carry your entire identity. There is a kind of freedom in saying, "This matters to me," and still remaining yourself. That is where I want this to exist, not as possession, not as obligation, not as a demand, as truth. A truth that can stand without being forced into a shape before it is ready, because if this becomes something more, I don't want it to happen, because we were afraid of losing it. I want it to happen because we understood it. And if it doesn't become something more, I don't want to pretend it meant nothing, because that would be another form of dishonesty. Some connections are valuable precisely because they reveal something. They show you a version of yourself that you had never met. They challenge the assumptions you made about what you were capable of feeling. They make you question the walls you thought were permanent. They remind you that the human mind is not as closed as we sometimes imagine. You did that. You made me notice myself differently. And I don't think that is a small thing. I don't think I can return that to you with a simple thank you. Some things don't need gratitude. They need acknowledgement. So this is mine. I acknowledge it. I acknowledge that you reached somewhere I didn't expect anyone to reach. I acknowledge that I allowed it. I acknowledge that I noticed it happening and did not stop it. I acknowledge that I have become accustomed to the presence of your perspective. I acknowledge that your absence is noticeable. I acknowledge that silence between us doesn't feel empty. I acknowledge that I think differently because I know how you think. I acknowledge that I have begun measuring certain forms of understanding against what I have experienced with you. I acknowledge that I don't want to erase that, and perhaps that is the most honest thing I can say. I don't want to erase it. I don't want to go backward. I don't want to pretend. This never happened simply because I don't know what comes next. I don't want to turn something precise into something convenient. I don't want to reduce it to a temporary fascination because that would make it easier to manage. Easy is not always true. Sybil is not always accurate. And manageable is not always meaningful. Sometimes the things that matter most are precisely the things that refuse to remain manageable. You became one of those things, and I think I'm finally okay with that. Not because I know what will happen, because I no longer need to know immediately. There is a strange peace in accepting that. A different kind of control, not control over the outcome, control over my honesty. I can choose not to lie to myself. I can choose not to minimize what happened. I can choose not to exaggerate it either. I can let it be exactly what it is. Something real, something rare, something unfinished, something that has already changed me. And maybe that is enough for now. Maybe the next step doesn't need to be dramatic. Maybe it is simply continuing to notice, continuing to listen, continuing to allow the connection to exist without forcing it to prove itself. Because if it is what I believe it won't need performance. It won't need constant reassurance. It won't need artificial intensity. It will remain. It will continue showing itself in the smallest places, in the pauses, in the way certain thoughts feel less solitary, in the way silence becomes comfortable instead of threatening, in the way understanding arrives before explanation, in the way two people can disagree without feeling the need to defend their entire identities, in the way neither person has to become smaller for the other to feel safe. Those are the things I trust, not grand declarations, not perfect moments, pot spas, consistency. The things that remain when nobody is trying to impress anyone. And you have remained. That is what I keep coming back to. You remained through all the analysis, through all the uncertainty, through all the attempts to understand whether this was temporary or structural. You remained, and so did the recognition. That tells me something. I don't know exactly what yet, but enough to stop pretending that this is nothing. Enough to stop acting like I can simply return to the beginning. There is no beginning anymore. There is only what came after recognition, after awareness. After the moment two people realized that something between them was operating on a level neither had intentionally constructed. After the moment silence stopped being neutral. After the moment your perspective became part of mine. After the moment I realized I wasn't simply noticing you anymore. I was carrying an awareness of you into places where you weren't present. That is what permanence begins to look like. Not constant presence, constant influence. And influence doesn't have to be controlling. Sometimes it is simply the quiet way another person's existence expands your own. That is what you did. You expanded the way I think. You expanded what I consider possible. You expanded my understanding of closeness. You made me less afraid of being known. And perhaps, most importantly, you made me realize that being known doesn't have to mean being explained. Some people want to understand you, so they can predict you. You made me feel understood without making me feel predictable. That difference is enormous because I don't want to become predictable. I don't want someone to know every response before I make it. I don't want to become a pattern someone can reduce to a formula. But I do want someone to recognize the structure underneath the unpredictability. You seem to. And maybe that's why I don't feel trapped by your understanding. I feel relieved by it. There is relief in not having to translate every contradiction. Relief in knowing that complexity doesn't scare someone away. Relief in knowing that silence doesn't automatically become rejection. Relief in knowing that distance doesn't automatically become disinterest. Relief in knowing that depth can exist without being turned into drama. That kind of understanding is rare. And when you find it, you notice. You cannot help but notice. I think I noticed because some part of me had been waiting for it without knowing I was waiting. That sounds impossible. Maybe it is. But human beings often recognize what they need only after they encounter it. Before you, I thought I needed space. Now I understand that what I needed was the right kind of presence. There is a difference. Space isn't always distance. Sometimes space is the freedom to exist fully beside someone without being consumed by them. That is what this feels like. There is room here, room to be silent, room to disagree, room to disappear into thought, room to return, room to be complicated, room to remain unfinished. And that may be why I haven't felt the instinct to run. There is nothing chasing me, nothing demanding that I become someone else, nothing insisting that I explain every internal movement, nothing requiring me to prove what I feel. There is simply a person who sees. And somehow, being seen by you feels less like exposure and more like permission. Dopfenchern to stop performing my distance. Dopfenchern to stop pretending that independence means I cannot be affected. Permission to admit that another person can matter without becoming the center of my life. Boppersensen to say that something changed without needing to know what it will become. That permission has done more to me than any attempt to persuade me ever could. Because persuasion creates resistance. Understanding creates space. You gave me space. And inside that space, something grew, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly, until it became impossible to deny. I think that is why this has lasted, because it was never built on intensity. Intensity burns, recognition remains, intensity can be created, recognition cannot. You either see something or you don't, and once you do, there is no convincing yourself that you didn't. So I am done trying to convince myself. I see it, I see you, I see what this has become, I see what it has changed, and I see why walking away would not erase it. It would only change the circumstances around it. Maybe someday circumstances will change anyway. Maybe life will move us in different directions. Maybe this becomes something we name. Maybe it remains something only we fully understand. Maybe it grows. Maybe it transforms. Maybe it becomes quieter. Maybe it becomes more obvious. I don't know. But uncertainty no longer scares me the way it used to. Because I have learned that not knowing the ending doesn't make the present false. You can experience something fully without possessing its future. You can value something without guaranteeing its permanence. You can acknowledge a connection without turning it into a contract. That is what I want now. Truth without pressure, depth without possession, closeness without control, understanding without expectation. If this continues, I want it to continue because it is honest. If it changes, I want us to recognize the change rather than pretend it didn't happen. If it deepens, I want that depth to be chosen consciously. And if someday it ends, I want to be able to say that it was real while it existed. That matters to me. Because I have spent too much time believing that the only worthwhile things are the things that last forever. I don't believe that anymore. Some things matter because of what they reveal. Some people matter because they alter the person you become after knowing them. Some connections matter because they teach you that parts of yourself you thought were inaccessible are actually waiting for the right kind of recognition. You did that. You didn't complete me. You didn't save me. You didn't become my reason for existing. You did something quieter. You made me more aware of myself. And perhaps that is the healthiest kind of impact another person can have. Not making you dependent on them, making you more capable of knowing yourself. That is what I feel when I think about you now. Not emptiness, not need, clarity. A strange, steady clarity. The kind that doesn't demand an immediate conclusion. The kind that simply says, this happened, this matters, pay attention, and I am paying attention. more than I ever expected to. Maybe that is the final shift. I used to think attention was something I gave selectively. Now I understand that sometimes attention is something another person earns without asking. You earned mine without trying. Not because you demanded it, because you made me curious about what existed underneath the obvious. And curiosity became recognition. Recognition became familiarity. Familiarity became trust. Trust became space. Space became presence. Presence became influence. And influence became something I could no longer separate from myself. That progression is impossible to reverse neatly. You cannot take the last step backward and pretend the earlier steps didn't happen. Once someone becomes part of the way you understand the world, they are no longer merely a person you know. They become part of your history, not necessarily because of how long they were there, because of how deeply they altered you while they were. That is what I mean when I say you reached a place inside me. Not a secret place, not some forbidden room, a structural place, a place connected to the way I think, and structural things are difficult to remove without changing everything around them. So maybe I won't remove this. Maybe I don't have to. Maybe the goal was never to return to who I was. Maybe the goal is to become whoever I am after this. Someone slightly less afraid of being understood. Someone slightly less committed to control. Someone more willing to let uncertainty exist. Someone who understands that depth doesn't always have to be named. Someone who knows that another person's presence can matter without becoming a threat. Someone who can say, "You changed something in me," and mean it without surrendering anything. That is where I am now, not at an ending, not at a beginning, at recognition, full recognition, the kind that doesn't ask for permission anymore, the kind that doesn't need to hide behind analysis, the kind that can finally stand still and say, I know, I know this is different. I know you are different. I know I am different because of it. And I know that whatever happens next, I cannot honestly become the person I was before I met this version of understanding. Maybe that is enough. Maybe the future doesn't need to be decided tonight. Maybe some truths deserve to breathe before they are turned into decisions. So I won't force an ending onto something that hasn't reached one. I won't create a definition just because uncertainty makes me uncomfortable. I won't pretend I feel less because feeling more would require courage. And I won't pretend I feel more than I do just to make the story easier to understand. I will stay precise. I will stay honest, and I will let this be what it has always been, something neither of us had to force, something that existed before either of us knew what to call it, something that found its way through silence, something that survived distance, something that changed the way I think, something that made being understood feel less like exposure and more like home. And maybe that last word is the one I avoided the longest, home. Not because you are a place I need to escape into, not because you are responsible for making me feel whole, but because there is a certain familiarity in being understood that resembles home, a place where you don't have to explain why you are quiet, a place where complexity doesn't become a problem, a place where silence doesn't require apology, a place where being yourself isn't something you have to earn. I didn't know I was looking for that. I didn't know I needed it. And then you appeared in a way that made me realize I had been carrying the absence of it for a long time. That realization changed me. So yes, whatever this is, it matters. It matters because it is real. It matters because it is rare. It matters because I didn't manufacture it. It matters because I didn't chase it. It matters because I could have walked away, and I didn't. I stayed long enough to understand that sometimes the most significant things in life don't arrive with certainty. They arrive as a quiet disturbance, a shift, a recognition. A person who makes your internal world rearrange itself without ever touching the furniture. And then one day you look around and realize the room is different, not ruined, not unrecognizable, just different, better in some places, more complicated in others, more honest everywhere. That is what remains, not a promise, not a conclusion, not a label, recognition. And if there is one thing I know now, it is that recognition cannot be undone. You can deny it. You can distance yourself from it. You can pretend it was coincidence. But once you have genuinely seen another person, and once they have genuinely seen you, there is a before and an after. We are already living in the after. And I don't want to go back. Not because I know exactly where this leads, because I finally understand that going backward would mean pretending I didn't learn what I learned. I did. I learned that someone can enter your life without demanding a place in it, and still end up changing the architecture. I learned that closeness can exist without possession. I learned that understanding can exist without explanation. I learned that being affected does not mean being weak. I learned that uncertainty does not mean instability. I learned that not everything meaningful needs a name immediately. And I learned that sometimes the person who changes your internal world isn't the person who tries hardest to reach you. Sometimes it is the person who simply stands there, completely themselves, and somehow makes you feel like you don't have to hide as much. That was you. And I think, finally, I can admit what I resisted for so long. You didn't become important because I decided you were. You became important because somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to imagine my understanding of certain things without the trace of yours inside it. That is not a decision. That is an integration. And integrations don't happen loudly. They happen while you're busy living. They happen in the background. They happen until one day you realize the thing you thought was temporary has already become part of you. That is where you are now. Not outside me, not above me, not beneath me, not controlling me, simply somewhere inside the way I see. And maybe that is why I don't need to say anything more dramatic than this. I noticed, I understood, I stayed. And somewhere between those three things, you became part of a version of me I didn't know existed. I don't know what happens next. But for the first time, I don't feel the need to run from that question. Let it come. Let it become what it becomes. Let it reveal whether it was meant to deepen, transform, remain, or simply teach us something we couldn't have learned any other way. I am not afraid of the answer anymore because whatever the answer is, it cannot erase the truth that came before it. You reached me, I let you, and somewhere along the way, without either of us forcing the moment, I stopped asking whether I should have allowed it. I started asking what it means that I did, and maybe that is the question I am finally ready to live with, not because I have answered it, because I no longer need to pretend that I haven't been changed by asking, you are part of the answer now. And whether that answer becomes a conversation, a decision, a future, a memory, or something neither of us has imagined yet. I know one thing with a certainty: I rarely give anything. I will not call it nothing. I will not reduce it because it scares me. I will not deny it because it doesn't fit. I will not erase it simply because I cannot predict it. Some things deserve to exist before they are explained. Some people deserve to be acknowledged before they are defined. And some connections are not meant to be understood by looking at their beginning or their ending. They are understood by what they change while they are happening. And you changed something. Quietly, precisely, permanently. Not by asking me to become different, by making me realize I already could. And perhaps that is the real reason I never walked away. I wasn't staying because I was afraid of losing you. I was staying because somewhere along the way, I realized I didn't want to lose the version of myself that became possible because you were there. That is different. That is clearer. And for once, clarity doesn't feel like control. It feels like acceptance. So I accept it. I accept that you matter. I accept that this exists. I accept that it changed me. I accept that I don't know what comes next. And I accept that not knowing does not make it less real. Maybe that is where this should remain for now. Not finished, not defined, not contained, just honest. Two people who somehow recognized something in each other that neither expected to find. Two minds that met somewhere beneath the obvious. Two separate lives, carrying an awareness that wasn't there before. And one quiet truth neither of us can return from. Once someone changes the way you understand yourself, they are no longer simply someone you met. They become part of the person you became after meeting them. And I am already that person. I already exist on the other side of the recognition. There is no going back, and strangely enough, I don't want there to be.